Something roams these woods that doesn't act like anything known. It doesn't chase, it corners. It doesn't roar, it listens. Campers report strange patterns: stacked rocks, snapped branches too high for any animal, and an awful stillness that settles right before things go wrong. Entire groups have disappeared without a struggle, leaving behind full packs and wide-eyed dogs that won't stop shaking. Locals won't hike there, not even in daylight. They say it moves differently, deliberate, calculating. And when the forest turns unnaturally still, it means one thing: whatever's out there has noticed you. Every July 4th, 33-year-old Travis McMullen and his longtime friends gathered for their traditional men's-only camping trip. What had begun as a college tradition had evolved into their most treasured annual ritual, a chance to disconnect from responsibilities and reconnect with each other. This particular year of 2024, seeking greater solitude, they ventured deeper into the evergreen highlands than ever before, where they pitched their tents along the tranquil banks of the Kellihan River, Washington. The group consisted of Travis, an architectural engineer with a passion for outdoor photography; Jeremy Blackwood, a high school history teacher with 3 young children; Malik Washington, a recently divorced financial analyst; Carter Phelps, a registered nurse who had just completed his master's degree; and Mason Thornhill, the eternal bachelor who worked as a forest ranger in eastern Washington. They had been inseparable since their freshman year way back. The forest around them felt eerily silent that weekend, lacking the usual chorus of birds and insects that typically accompanied their trips. Travis jokingly blamed it on hungover deer still recovering from firework displays, but Mason, with his forestry background, had seemed genuinely perplexed by the unnatural quiet. On the night of July 4th, distant fireworks from the nearest town were barely visible through the dense canopy, creating muted flashes of color that struggled to penetrate the wilderness. The men had celebrated with their usual traditions: grilled steaks, exaggerated stories from their youth, and perhaps too many beers. By 1 a.m., everyone had retreated to their respective tents, the campfire reduced to glowing embers. Around 2 a.m., Travis stepped out to relieve himself behind the row of tents. The air felt unusually heavy, and the moonlight barely penetrated the thick forest canopy. What happened next would forever change his life. Travis later reported hearing what he initially thought was a man grunting, followed by the distinct crack of a tree branch snapping like a gunshot. His instincts immediately signaled danger. Moments later, chaos erupted through their peaceful campsite. Travis fled barefoot through sharp brambles as something massive and impossibly fast tore through their camp. He could hear Jeremy screaming behind him, terrible sounds that abruptly stopped seconds later. Travis didn't stop running until he reached a ranger station miles away, his feet bruised and bloody, his mind scarred with images he couldn't fully process. When authorities reached the campsite hours later, they discovered a scene of unimaginable destruction. The tents had been shredded, not cut but torn apart with tremendous force. Their supplies were scattered across a 50-yard radius, some items thrown into the river. The cooler had been crushed, aluminum cans flattened like paper. Of Travis's 4 friends, only partial remains were recovered. The most disturbing evidence came from the surrounding forest. Deep scratches were found on trees over 8 feet high, and several smaller trees had been snapped, not cut or chewed, but broken with force that suggested something of enormous strength had moved through the area. Large, unusual footprints were found in the softer soil near the riverbank, though rain had partially obscured their details. The official medical examiner's report blamed a bear attack, citing the region's healthy population of black bears and occasional reports of grizzlies. But Travis vehemently rejected this explanation during his multiple interviews with authorities. What he had glimpsed in those terrifying moments before fleeing had human-like limbs, hair matted like dreadlocks, and eyes that reflected amber light in the darkness. It had moved with purpose, not like a startled animal. Local tribal elders from the Quileute Nation refused to comment officially when reporters sought their insight, though one elder privately told a local newspaper that certain areas of the forest had long been considered forbidden ground, places where the ancient ones still walked. In the months following the incident, The case attracted attention from cryptozoologists and paranormal researchers. Some pointed to the unusual silence in the forest as a classic precursor to Sasquatch encounters. Others noted the similarities between Travis's description and dozens of historical accounts from the Pacific Northwest, describing similar creatures. Park authorities closed that section of the Evergreen Highlands for the remainder of the summer, citing environmental assessment needs rather than public safety concerns. No official footage or conclusive evidence was ever presented, leaving just one traumatized survivor's account and a forest that no longer welcomed visitors. Travis McMullen moved to Arizona the following year, abandoning his love for the outdoors. He declined all interview requests after an initial press conference, but self-published a memoir titled What Waits in Silence that became popular in cryptozoology circles. The official report on the deaths of Jeremy, Malik, Carter, and Mason remained classified as an animal attack, though the specific species was listed as undetermined in the final documentation. Park rangers reported that wildlife still avoided the area 3 years later. Local hiking guides began avoiding the entire eastern section of the river valley, telling tourists it was to protect sensitive habitats. But among themselves, they shared Travis's story as a warning about venturing too deep into wilderness where humans might no longer be welcome or at the top of the food chain. In the summer of 1991, avid outdoorsman Lucian Popescu and his younger cousin Andre embarked on what was meant to be a challenging but rewarding hiking expedition through Romania's formidable Făgărașan highlands. The region, known for its pristine alpine lakes and dramatic landscapes, had attracted serious hikers for generations, despite its notorious reputation for sudden weather changes and confusing trails that had claimed lives over the decades. Lucian, a 36-year-old geological engineer from Bucharest, had traversed these mountains numerous times before. His expertise and intimate knowledge of the terrain had given him confidence to take his 24-year-old cousin, Andrei Mitrace, a medical student, on this particularly remote route. The pair had meticulously planned their journey, mapping their course through the isolated wilderness surrounding Lake Dorința, one of the deepest glacial lakes in the Carpathian Range. The cousins were well equipped for their expedition, carrying top-quality gear, emergency supplies, and a satellite radio that Lucian used faithfully each evening to check in with family members. They had experienced perfect hiking conditions for the first 2 days of their journey, making excellent progress as they followed the ancient shepherd paths that wound through the jagged terrain. On the evening of their second day, Andre made their scheduled radio call to Lucian's parents in Bucharest, reporting that they had reached their planned checkpoint near the western shores of Lake Dorința. He described the stunning sunset reflection on the water's surface and mentioned their plans to reach the northern ridge by midday tomorrow. It was the last time either man would make contact with civilization according to plan. When no radio call came the following evening, Lucian's parents initially attributed it to technical difficulties or poor reception in the mountains. By the third day of silence, they contacted mountain rescue authorities, who immediately dispatched search teams to the hikers' last known coordinates. The subsequent search operation involved over 40 experienced rescuers, 3 helicopter sweeps, and several trained tracking dogs, the largest mountain rescue effort in the region since the aftermath of a devastating avalanche in 1987. 2 agonizing weeks after their disappearance, a search party discovered Andrei Mitrace in a semi-conscious state, hiding inside a hollow tree trunk nearly 11 kilometers from where the pair had last reported their position. He was severely dehydrated, his feet bloodied and shoeless, his clothing torn and soiled. Most disturbing was his psychological state. The young medical student appeared traumatized beyond recognition, flinching at sudden movements and unable to form coherent sentences. Authorities transported Andre to the nearest hospital in Hunedoara, where he remained under medical supervision for several days before regaining the ability to speak. When he finally broke his silence, his account sent chills through the rescue team. Andre claimed that something had taken Lucian, not dragged but lifted and thrown, during their hike alongside a steep rock face. He described an entity that moved on two legs like a man, but too fast and too wide, with unusual proportions that defied logical explanation. According to Andre's fractured testimony, the cousins had awakened to strange noises outside their tent shortly before dawn. Lucien had stepped out to investigate, believing it might be a brown bear. What happened next had occurred with terrifying speed. A massive dark shape had emerged from between the trees, seized Lucien, and hurled him against a distant rock face with unnatural strength. When Andre fled in terror, the creature had pursued him faster than any human could run, forcing him to hide in increasingly desperate locations over several days. The search for Lucien Popescu continued for another month, but yielded troubling evidence rather than the missing hiker. Search teams discovered unusual damage to trees nearly 10 feet above ground level, branches broken downward, as if something large had moved through the canopy. Near the location where Andre claimed the attack occurred, investigators found several long strands of coarse black hair caught in tree bark, which laboratory analysis later determined did not match any known regional wildlife. The official investigation report filed by Romanian authorities classified Lucien's case as a probable animal attack, though the cause of death was officially listed as undetermined due to the absence of a body. Some investigators privately acknowledged the inconsistencies in this conclusion, particularly the unusual height of the broken branches and the inexplicable strength required to throw a grown man across a significant distance. Andre Mitrace abandoned his medical studies after the incident, relocating to a coastal town far from the mountains. He refused all interview requests from journalists and researchers interested in the case, though local residents reported he suffered from severe night terrors for years afterward. When approached by a documentary crew in 2003, he reportedly stated that what lives in those mountains isn't in any biology textbook, before refusing further comment. The Făgărașan Highlands remained a popular hiking destination in the decades that followed, though local guides began warning visitors against camping near Lake Dorința. The region acquired a subtle reputation among Romania's hiking community, with experienced mountaineers often choosing to traverse the area in larger groups and always in daylight hours, regardless of their usual hiking preferences. When 26-year-old artist Hana Kobayashi ventured into the dense woodland known locally as the Curahoro Forest Preserve in early spring of 2010, she wasn't drawn by any of the eerie folklore associated with the area. Unlike those who sought its secluded depths for darker purposes, Hana simply wanted to capture the splendor of a hidden volcanic peak at dawn from a clearing she had discovered while researching an obscure nature guide published in the 1970s. Hana had recently graduated with a master's degree in traditional landscape painting. Her thesis project, exploring the intersection of traditional Japanese art forms with modern environmental concerns, had gained modest recognition in local art circles. This early morning excursion was meant to provide inspiration for her upcoming exhibition at a small gallery in Shinjuku that specialized in emerging artists. The Curahoro Forest, nestled in a remote volcanic basin in central Honshu, was unlike other forests in the region. The floor was rocky, blanketed by moss and interrupted by tumbled roots. The twisted, gnarled trees grew at odd angles due to uneven volcanic ground, and sound rarely traveled far in the dense vegetation. Hana had meticulously prepared for her solo journey, packing her specialized art supplies, a high-resolution camera for reference photos, and a lightweight tripod to stabilize her setup. She had informed her older brother Daisuke of her exact plans, promising to check in regularly via cell phone despite the area's poor reception. An experienced day hiker, she had mapped her route carefully, planning to reach the secluded viewpoint well before the first light of dawn illuminated the misty ridge. At around 5:30 a.m. on that crisp March morning, Hana called Daisuke as promised, her voice excited as she reported reaching her destination. She described setting up her tripod and preparing her materials as the eastern sky began showing the first faint indications of daybreak. Her final words to her brother were about the unusual stillness of the forest that morning. Not even birds were calling. The phone call ended abruptly mid-sentence. When Daisuke immediately tried calling back, her phone rang 5 times before switching to voicemail. His increasingly frantic calls over the next hour went unanswered. By noon that day, Daisuke had contacted authorities, and a search operation commenced. Park rangers, police, and volunteer search teams combed the area where Hana had indicated she would be sketching. What they discovered raised more questions than answers. Her phone was located on a moss-covered log, still powered on, but with no sign of damage. Approximately 20 meters away, they found her tripod, not merely collapsed, but bent and twisted, as if struck with tremendous force. Her camera was never recovered. Nearby, they also found her sketchbook partially tucked beneath a fern. Several pages had been torn or disturbed, but the book still contained a number of early pencil sketches, including notes on light angles and terrain features. Forensic teams documented a large depression in the rocky soil near the site, consistent with something heavy landing from a considerable height. No animals native to the region were known to create such markings. Several trees in the vicinity showed unusual damage patterns, with bark scraped away at heights between 7 and 9 feet above ground level, far higher than bears or other local wildlife could reach. Despite an exhaustive 3-week search operation that expanded well beyond the initial site, Hana Kobayashi's body was never recovered. The Japanese authorities officially classified her case as a disappearance under suspicious circumstances, though the lead investigator privately acknowledged to Daisuke that certain evidence didn't align with any known predator or criminal pattern. Local residents from nearby villages shared centuries-old folklore about the forest harboring strange entities that guarded the ancient volcanic pathways. A few elder residents warned search teams about venturing too deep into certain areas, particularly during transitional times like dawn and dusk, when boundaries between the known and unknown were considered thinner. Some younger hikers reported rumors of a hairy man with no voice, who moved silently among the twisted trees during early morning hours. The Kobayashi family established a small memorial stone at the forest's edge, rather than at the site of disappearance, as rangers discouraged visitors from seeking the exact location. Daisuke eventually published a collection of his sister's artwork, including her earlier sketches of the surrounding highlands, but notably excluding her final unfinished drawing, which remained sealed in police evidence. In the years following Hana's disappearance, forest authorities installed additional warning signs throughout the Kurohoro Preserve, discouraging solo hikers from venturing off marked trails. Rangers began enforcing stricter dawn-to-dusk policies, citing wildlife management concerns, rather than addressing the unsettling circumstances surrounding the young artist who had only wanted to capture the morning light as it first touched the sleeping mountains of central Japan. In the eastern reaches of Angola's Moxico province, far from the coastal cities where most foreigners congregated, the Siltmarsh expanse sprawled across nearly 14,500 square kilometers of diverse ecosystems. The expanse encompassed vast wetlands that gradually transitioned into dry forest and plains, creating a unique habitat for countless species that had barely been documented by Western science. It was this scientific potential that brought the Soviet-funded expedition to its remote boundaries in the late summer of 1977, despite the ongoing civil unrest that had plagued the newly independent nation. Dr. Roman Izmailov, a respected biologist specializing in comparative primate anatomy, led the ambitious biological survey team. The Soviet Union, eager to establish scientific connections with newly socialist African nations, had provided generous funding for the expedition as a gesture of solidarity with Angola's MPLA government. Dr. Izmailov was accompanied by 3 promising Angolan graduate students. João Mbaiji, a zoologist focused on large mammal populations; Pedro Kahemba, a botanist cataloging medicinal plants; and Teresa Ndongo, an entomologist documenting insect species unique to the transitional forest zones. The expedition had established its base camp in a clearing approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest village, setting up 3 reinforced canvas tents around a central research area. Their solar-powered equipment represented cutting-edge technology for field research in 1977, particularly the motion-triggered camera traps designed to capture nocturnal wildlife activity without human interference. After 3 productive weeks documenting dozens of previously uncatalogued plant and insect species, the team began focusing on a peculiar area near the marshland's edge where animal tracks mysteriously disappeared. On the evening of September 12th, while setting a camera trap near a partially rotted log at the forest's edge, Dr. Izmailov and Joan discovered something that immediately struck them as unnatural. A circular clearing, approximately 15 meters in diameter, appeared among the dense trees. But unlike natural clearings formed by fallen trees or lightning strikes, this one exhibited a strange pattern. The surrounding trees were bent outward, away from the center. Their trunks snapped at consistent heights of approximately 3 meters, as if something massive had pushed outward with tremendous force. Dr. Izmailov noted in his field journal that the pattern resembled blast damage, yet lacked burn marks or other indicators of explosion. Joan suggested they collect soil samples from the clearing's center, where a depression approximately 2 meters wide showed signs of recent disturbance. They extracted several core samples and discovered an unusual layer of sediment approximately 50 centimeters below the surface that contained fragments of an unidentified material. Neither plant nor animal tissue, but something with a distinctly organic composition that neither scientist could immediately identify. That night, while processing the soil samples at their base camp laboratory tent, Joan abruptly left to check a perimeter sensor that had triggered an alert. 20 minutes later, he burst into the camp screaming incoherently, blood streaming from a deep laceration across his right shoulder. Once calmed by Teresa, he claimed he had seen something man-shaped but impossibly thick, watching him from the swamp's edge, its eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight with an unusual reddish glow. When he approached what he initially thought might be another researcher, the entity had moved with shocking speed, striking him before disappearing into the darkness. The team treated Joan's wound, which appeared more consistent with a slashing injury than a bite or claw mark from known predators. Dr. Izmailov documented the wound with photographs, noting the unusual parallel pattern of the laceration that didn't match any known animal attack profile. Despite Joan's obvious distress, the other team members suspected he might be suffering from infection-induced delirium, as the wound showed immediate signs of unusual inflammation. By dawn, the camp had been obliterated. 2 tents were found flattened, their aluminum support poles bent and twisted. The 3rd tent, containing their communications equipment, had vanished entirely. Joan's body was discovered nearly 30 meters from the camp, lodged high in the fork of a fig tree. His legs were broken in multiple places, and his head had been twisted around in a manner impossible without complete severation of the spinal cord. Teresa and Dr. Izmailov were nowhere to be found, despite extensive searching. Only Pedro Cahemba survived, having been away from camp collecting night-blooming plant specimens. After discovering the devastation at dawn, he trekked more than 65 kilometers through hostile terrain to reach the nearest outpost with functioning communications. His journal, later submitted to authorities, contained increasingly frantic entries referring cryptically to O Homem dos Pantanos, which means the swamp man, and described hearing footsteps too heavy for any human circling his hiding places during his desperate journey to safety. The Angolan government, already struggling with civil conflict, classified the incident as a tragic encounter with territorial wildlife, officially blaming a leopard attack. The Soviet embassy quietly withdrew all research funding for the region, and the collected specimens were sealed in a military archive rather than distributed to scientific institutions as originally planned. The soil samples and unidentified organic material disappeared entirely from the official inventory. Pedro Cahemba abandoned his scientific career and refused all interview requests until 1989, when a Brazilian documentary filmmaker briefly spoke with him. In that final interview, conducted in Portuguese, he made a single cryptic reference to red eyes set in a face too wide, too flat, and standing at a height that no man could reach. He refused to elaborate further and moved from his home shortly afterward. disappearing from public record entirely. The silt marsh expanse remained largely unexplored by scientific expeditions for decades afterward, its isolation reinforced by Angola's prolonged civil conflict. Local tribes in the region added new elements to their traditional warning stories about certain areas of the wetlands, places where they claimed the boundaries between the known and unknown world had grown dangerously thin. The ancient forests of northern Spain's Leon province had witnessed centuries of human history, from Celtic settlements to Roman conquests, from medieval monasteries to modern conservation efforts. Among these verdant mountains, the Montelbosque Reserve was particularly noteworthy for its biodiversity and stunning vistas. The name itself, mountain forest, reflected the rugged terrain and wild habitats of the region. But according to local folklore, bears weren't the only large creatures that called these valleys home. In late autumn of 2002, as the forest transformed into a tapestry of russet and gold, wildlife photographer Inés Valverde and two botanists ventured into Montelbosque to document endangered flora and fauna for a research project. Inés, 34, had built a modest reputation capturing elusive Iberian wildlife, including a rare photograph of a brown bear with cubs that had earned her recognition in conservation circles. Her companions were botanists Ramon Rivas, 41, a specialist in mountain flora who had published extensively on endangered orchid species, and Ernesto Calle, 29, a doctoral candidate researching climate change effects on alpine plant communities. The trio had obtained special permits to access restricted areas of the reserve where human presence was typically forbidden. Their ambitious 10-day expedition aimed to document several species on the brink of extinction before winter dormancy began. Their secondary objective involved photographing the ruins of the 12th century monastery of Santo Aureliano, an abandoned religious complex rumored to contain undocumented botanical carvings of medicinal plants used by medieval monks. Despite warnings from elderly residents in the nearby village of Castañeda that the forest beyond the monastery ruins harbored dangerous secrets, the researchers dismissed such tales as superstition. The locals refused to venture past the crumbling stone walls after dusk, claiming the mountains had guardians that predated both Christianity and human settlement. When pressed for details, villagers would make the sign of the cross and mention El hombre alto del bosque, the tall man of the forest, before changing the subject. The first 2 days of the expedition proceeded without incident. The team established their camp in a protected valley, approximately half a kilometer from the monastery ruins, setting up modern equipment that contrasted starkly with the ancient forest surrounding them. Their satellite phone provided their only connection to civilization, with scheduled daily check-ins established with university colleagues. On the third evening, as twilight descended and temperatures dropped sharply, Ernesto left the warming fire pit to relieve himself near the tree line, approximately 30 meters from camp. When he hadn't returned after 15 minutes, Ramon called out for him. Receiving no response, the two remaining researchers began searching with flashlights, calling Ernesto's name with increasing urgency as darkness enveloped the forest. The search continued until sunrise, with Inés and Ramon taking turns resting while the other continued looking. Their discovery at dawn chilled them more than the autumn frost. Ernesto's hiking boots had been placed neatly, side by side, at the edge of the forest, where the trees grew densest. The arrangement appeared deliberate, not haphazard as would be expected in an animal attack or accidental injury. Most disturbing was the complete absence of tracks or disturbance around the boots, as if Ernesto had simply vanished or been lifted straight up from where he stood. Their satellite call to authorities triggered an immediate search operation. 2 forest rangers arrived by helicopter that afternoon, bringing tracking dogs that showed unusual reluctance to enter certain areas of the forest. The rangers advised Inés and Ramon to abandon their expedition, but both researchers refused to leave without learning their colleagues' fate. Instead, they continued their scientific work by day while sleeping in shifts at night, one always keeping watch while the other rested. In her journal, later recovered by investigators, Inés noted increasingly strange occurrences over the following days. Equipment moved during the night despite being securely stored. Unusual silence descending over sections of forest that should have been alive with wildlife. And most disturbing, the distinct sensation of being watched from just beyond the firelight's reach. Ramon reported hearing rhythmic sounds during his watch. Not quite footsteps, but something heavy moving with deliberate pace through the underbrush, circling their camp but never approaching directly. On their fifth and final night in the Montelbosque Reserve, the entity that had been observing them finally made its presence known. According to Inez's frantic satellite phone call to emergency services, something massive circled their camp shortly after midnight, moving just beyond the illumination of their fire. Ramon had insisted on investigating a strange sound, approximately 10 meters from their tent. Inez's call captured the beginning of his screams, sounds that the responding officer described as not those of a man facing a wild animal, but of someone experiencing something his mind couldn't process. By the time authorities reached the remote campsite the following day, Ramon had vanished. A trail of blood led from the shredded remains of his sleeping bag to a point approximately 20 meters into the forest, where it abruptly ended. There were no signs of the body being dragged further, no indication of where he might have been taken. Most puzzling to investigators, the blood trail showed no accompanying footprints from either Ramon or his attacker, despite the soft forest floor that should have preserved such evidence. Inez Valverde was found hiding in a hollow tree trunk nearly a kilometer from camp, clutching her camera and exhibiting signs of severe shock. Once evacuated to safety, she refused to verbally discuss what she had witnessed. The Spanish Civil Guard officially attributed the incident to a bear attack, noting the presence of brown bears in the region. However, internal reports acknowledged troubling inconsistencies. The absence of claw marks on trees surrounding the camp, the unnatural gait pattern observed by witnesses, and the surgical precision with which Ramon had been separated from his sleeping bag without disturbing nearby equipment. Inez abandoned her celebrated career in wildlife photography immediately following the incident. She relocated to Barcelona, far from the mountains that had once been her passion, and refused all interview requests from journalists and researchers alike. Though rumors persisted in academic circles about what truly happened deep in the ancient forests of Leon, and what still walked there when humans ventured too deeply into its domain. The ancient woodlands surrounding Greymire Hollow in northwestern Ireland had long been whispered about in local pubs and around peat fires. County Donegal's remote forests harbored more than just red deer and wildcats. They contained stories as old as the island itself, passed down through generations about things that wandered between the gnarled oaks when mist rolled down from the mountains. Most tourists who visited the picturesque hollow remained safely on marked trails, admiring the lakeside manor and its gardens before departing well before twilight. But Tomas Riley and his wife Aileen had never been ones to follow conventional wisdom. The Rileys had embraced an alternative lifestyle long before van life became a social media phenomenon. In the spring of 1983, they had abandoned their small Dublin apartment and modest office jobs, investing their savings in a retrofitted 1976 Bedford van painted a cheerful blue. For 3 years, they had roamed Ireland's countryside, supporting themselves by selling handcrafted wool items and wooden trinkets at local markets. Tomas, 32, created intricate Celtic knotwork carvings on walking sticks and jewelry boxes, while Aileen, 29, had mastered traditional wool dyeing using plants she foraged from each region they visited. Their nomadic existence had brought them to the edges of Greymire Hollow in late September 1986. The tourist season was winding down, allowing them to find a secluded spot near an old logging track where they could park their van undisturbed. The location offered perfect access to fresh water from a nearby stream and forageable materials for Aileen's dyeing process. Local rangers were aware of their presence but turned a blind eye, as the couple was known for their respectful approach to nature and minimal environmental impact. On their third night near the forest, Tomas noted something unusual in his handwritten journal, a phenomenon neither of them could explain. While preparing their evening meal on a small camp stove outside the van, they observed what appeared to be pale, whitish lights moving silently between distant trees. The lights followed no path, appearing to float approximately 2 meters above the ground, sometimes stationary, before darting with impossible speed to new positions. Tomas initially suspected phosphorescent fungi or some atmospheric phenomenon, while Aileen, who had grown up hearing her grandmother's tales of the old ones, suggested they might be witnessing what locals called ghost lights or fairy lanterns. Over the next 4 evenings, the mysterious lights appeared consistently after sunset, seemingly drawing closer to their camp each night. Tomas documented their movements meticulously, noting that they appeared most frequently when mist descended from the higher elevations. In his final journal entry, dated October 2nd, he recorded Aileen's growing fascination with the lights, which she had begun to interpret as signals attempting to communicate. The skeptical Tomas had agreed to accompany her on a short expedition the following evening to observe the phenomena more closely, bringing along his film camera to document what they found. On the evening of October 3rd, a heavy storm system moved across Donegal, bringing unseasonable cold and dense fog that shrouded the forest in gray twilight even before sunset. According to Tomas's wristwatch, later recovered at the scene, the couple left their van at approximately 9:07 p.m., equipped with flashlights and rain gear. Neither carried any form of weapon or protection beyond a walking stick. They left the kettle warming on their camp stove, clearly intending to return shortly for evening tea. They were never seen alive again. 2 days later, a trio of German hikers discovered the Rileys' van while seeking shelter from persistent rain. Finding the vehicle unlocked with possessions inside undisturbed and a long cold kettle on the stove, they immediately reported the mysterious scene to park authorities. A search operation commenced within hours, focusing on the surrounding 5-kilometer radius of dense woodland. On the morning of October 7th, search teams discovered Tomas Riley's body in a small clearing, approximately 1.8 kilometers from the van. He was found slumped against a moss-covered boulder, his chest cavity catastrophically damaged as if struck by tremendous force. Most disturbing to investigators were the massive, bare footprints embedded in the muddy earth surrounding the clearing. Impressions measuring nearly 60 centimeters in length, with anatomical details that resembled human feet, albeit at an impossible scale. Despite extensive searching involving over 50 volunteers and trained dogs, Aileen Riley's body was never recovered. Her wool coat was found snagged on a thorny bush approximately halfway between the van and the clearing where Tomas was discovered, suggesting she had fled in a different direction. Several trees along her presumed escape route showed unusual damage patterns, with bark stripped away at heights unreachable without specialized equipment. The official investigation struggled to explain the scene. The local coroner's report noted that Tomas's injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma from a large tool or appendage, with the unusual pattern of rib fractures suggesting a single devastating impact rather than repeated blows. Local police initially suspected involvement from wildlife smugglers or illegal poachers, though this theory was abandoned when nothing was found stolen from the couple's van, which contained valuable tools and a small amount of cash. The government's official statement referenced animal involvement, without specifying what creature might have caused such unique damage patterns. Privately, some investigation team members noted the impossibility of reconciling the evidence with any known wildlife in Ireland, where the largest predators, badgers and pine martens, posed no threat to adult humans. Local residents had their own explanations. Older villagers spoke of ancient folklore regarding forest giants who guarded certain glens against human intrusion. The mysterious lights had featured in cautionary tales for centuries, described as entities that deliberately lured curious humans into dangerous territory, controlled by beings that preceded Celtic settlement of the island. In the decades following the incident, the specific area where Tomas Riley's body was found developed an unusually bad reputation, even among experienced hikers. Rangers reported that wildlife seemed to avoid the clearing, and plants grew poorly within its boundaries. Local guides began telling visitors that the area was environmentally sensitive to discourage exploration, while privately sharing warnings about a woman's voice, sometimes heard calling from deep within the forest when heavy fog descended from the mountains, a voice that always seemed to come from just beyond the next line of trees. no matter how far one followed. To this day, the disappearance of Tomas and Aileen Riley remains one of the most unsettling, unsolved cases in Irish history. Official records list it as a tragic accident, two free-spirited wanderers lost to the unforgiving elements. But those who have walked the misted paths of Greymire Hollow know better than to dismiss the old stories. Locals still leave offerings of bread and wool at the forest's edge, a quiet gesture of respect to whatever stirs among the ancient trees. And sometimes, on cold autumn nights, travelers report seeing two pale lights dancing together just beyond the fog, never close, but never quite gone.